enjoyed the book of Ruth coming up here? Yeah, right? Surprising. As we said earlier, like it's kind of a misnomer that it's a chick flick. There's a lot of cool stuff in here. And today, one of the things, right, we focused on Naomi, we kind of focused on Ruth, but today, kind of the star, if you will, of the first portion is actually Boaz, right? So we finally shift and focus on a guy, but we'll get to that in just a second. We're going to summarize where we've been so far in Ruth to kind of set up where we're going today in the passage. It opened up in chapter 1 where Naomi lost everything. She moved out, went to Moab with her husband because there was a famine, and while she was there, her husband died, her 2 sons died, and she was left with 2 daughter-in-laws from Moab. No kids, no grandkids, no nothing. So then she decided she was going to go back to the town she was from, which was Bethlehem. And that chapter ends with Naomi saying this line, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Lord has made me bitter, and his hand is against me. He has brought me back empty," right? I went away full, but he brought me back empty. And we saw that Naomi didn't know how to make sense of the tragedy and the crisis that was happening in her life. She wasn't able to walk in that middle place of mystery and faith, knowing that all of this is happening, but God has a redemption plan in store for me. And instead, she got angry and bitter towards God. But in chapter 2, something changes. Ruth, her daughter-in-law that decided to stay with her, goes off to a field. And this chapter is all about the coincidence that happens between her meeting Boaz. And she meets this guy, Boaz, right? A farmer, a wheat farmer, and he welcomes her in essentially to his family, if you will. She goes from homeless gleaner to somebody who's now part of his team, right? She's able to hang out with them. He gives her a bunch of food. He invites her to the table to sit with them. He gives her access to the water that only the employees and his family would have access to. So she's been taken in and totally cared for. And then when she goes back to Naomi with all of the extra food that she has, Naomi says something to the effect of, "Praise God, for he has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." And I think when Naomi says to the dead, she's referring to herself. So she went from angry and bitter at God because of everything that happened, and then moved to a God's doing something, and even through this, he's still showing me kindness, and then praises his name. Then in chapter 3, she says to herself, we got to make a plan. Ruth, it's not good for you to be stuck with me, this widow, so what I want you to do is go back to Boaz, because he's one of our kinsman redeemer. However you would say that with the plurals. I don't even know anymore. So she sent him off to Boaz in this really sketchy plan. You remember from last week? We're going to need to unpack it. But basically, Ruth approaches him in a very weird way to make a marriage proposal. Boaz agrees, but he says, "I'm not the one who's to redeem you. It's actually somebody else." So then Boaz promises the next morning he's going to get to business and go find this guy so that the redemption of Ruth and Naomi can take place. And then at the end of that passage, Naomi says something even more extraordinary. She says to Ruth, "Sit tight, because that guy Boaz, he won't rest until this is finished." And we can see there this major transformation that's taken place in Naomi. Even though it's called the book of Ruth, she's the main character. And we see her go from angry and bitter at God through the tragedy and crisis to hopeful, because she sees that God is doing something, and she understands that even there, God is still showing kindness. Then to, I've seen God's kindness, and now I'm going to respond to what I think God is doing. And then when she responds to what God is doing, she has faith and says, "Sit tight, this is going to happen." And in chapter 4, we get to see it all happen. So here's the conclusion of our story with Naomi and Ruth. Let's take out our Bibles, turn to chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So we went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. All right, believe it or not, those 2 verses are so important to unpack, to kind of understand the scene, to understand the setting of what's actually taking place here. When the author says, meanwhile, you can kind of imagine in a movie or a story where the characters on the one side are saying something and having a dialogue, while at the same time, another thing is happening over here. So we kind of left Naomi and Ruth having their conversation about what Boaz is going to do. Now we pivot over here, and Boaz is now taking the action on. And so he goes to this place, it says here in the scripture, to the town gate, right? He goes to this town gate. Let's go ahead and show that picture of the town gate really quickly, because this kind of helps us paint the scene of what's happening here in this town of Bethlehem. Oh, little town of Bethlehem, as it were. So there's the stone gate. You can kind of see right there the 10 elders plus Boaz and the other guy that are sitting there. But the reason it was at the town gate is because this was where the market would be. This is where the open space was. As you went into the city, the streets got more narrow and there was only space for houses. And so the reason Boaz is at the gate is two reasons. Number one, he wants to look for this kinsman redeemer, and when that kinsman redeemer shows up, we're going to get to business. But also, this is where the elders, where the council members, this is where they would meet to actually take care of these types of things. So it's not unusual, it's actually pretty typical. But you can imagine these guys getting together, and then as people are going in and out of the gate, kind of looking at this conversation and being intrigued. Busybodies, if you will. And then they stop and they listen. And as we see later, that's actually exactly what happened. There's a big crowd that starts to accumulate in this gate as they're listening to all of this. So, as Boaz is there, notice our author said, and just then, right, as we looked at in chapter 2, that's the author's way of saying coincidence with air quotes, right? Right as Boaz got to the gate, immediately the kinsman redeemer guy shows up. And when the kinsman redeemer guy shows up, Boaz calls to him. This is all letting us know that even though Boaz is the one making the plans, like we saw last week, God is in this. It's not coincidence. He brought Boaz there at the right time, and he brought the other guy there right at the right time so that no time is wasted. Then Boaz says this line to him. He says, my friend. It's not a name. It's not a name at all. And actually, I think in the Hebrew, there's no real good way to translate this. But this guy, this kinsman redeemer, he remains nameless through the rest of the story. He never gets a name. So we don't know who he is. We don't know his family line. We don't know anything about him at all. But he carries this name, my friend. Believe it or not, in the Hebrew, this is kind of an insult. It's a pejorative, right? Kind of disrespectful. The easiest way for us to think of it in our language is Joe Schmo. Joe Schmo. What does Joe Schmo mean? It means Joe Nobody. And that's what the author's trying to tell us. This guy is a Joe Schmo. He's a nobody. He's not important to anyone, anywhere. And Boaz, via the narrator, calls him Joe Schmo. Hey, Joe Schmo, come over here. Or, hey, John Doe, get over here. That type of a thing. So from now on throughout this, instead of saying kinsman redeemer, I'm just going to call him Joe Schmo. Is that fair? Perfect. Then he calls the elders. Now that we've introduced all of the others, we've got Boaz, we've got the gate understood, we've got Joe Schmo, the elders. These are the legal counsel that would be there at the gate. These people would be those that listen to all kinds of things, financial disputes, land disputes, murder trials, all kinds of legal issues. They would be the ones listening and they would adjudicate. What's odd about this scenario is that by law there needed to be 2 to 3 of these witnesses, but Boaz calls 10. We don't know why he called 10. The author never tells us why he calls 10. And nobody has a clue as to why he called 10. But he did. So that means there is well over the amount that's required for this whole deal to take place. So then, as Boaz is here, Boaz gets to business in the negotiation. I love this part because in chapter 2 or chapter 3, we kind of learned that Boaz is an older guy. He's probably past his physical prime. But right here, he shows us like, man, he's sharp, he knows what to do, he knows how to negotiate, and this guy means business. He is not playing around. You'll see how that plays out in this discussion. So let's look at verse 3. He says here, then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling a piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought you should bring the matter to our attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, then tell me, so I'll know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Again, believe it or not, in those 2 little verses, we get such huge hints as to the drama that's taking place in this story. One of the most obvious that should stand out to us right away is Boaz approaches the situation and says, Naomi has land to sell. land to sell? I thought she had nothing. I thought she was a widow. If she had land to sell, how come Ruth wasn't gleaning off of that land? Why did she go to Boaz's? Right? All of these questions start to pull. If she had land, why didn't she sell it, get some money, and then she and Ruth could have had a better time of it? What is happening here? All kinds of questions. Why would Naomi, how about this? Why would Naomi tell Ruth in chapter 1, I've got nothing to offer if she owned land? That doesn't make any sense. So what's happening here in the story? The short version of this is essentially nobody back then owned land in the way that we think of land ownership. All of the land ownership belonged to the clan. So remember, we have Israel the nation, we have the 12 tribes, and in each one of those 12 tribes were multiple clans. So this land was actually owned by the clan, and if anybody owned land, it was usage rights. It wasn't the actual dirt itself. It was the ability to build a house, you could raise crops, sell the crops, you could use it for money, all of those things. So it was usage rights. And this is probably what Naomi had. When Elimelech left, it's highly unlikely that he wouldn't have sold the land and taken care of all of his affairs. He probably did. So then when she came back, she still had the usage rights, or at least the right to redeem the land back, because it was Elimelech's originally. But because she's poor, because she's a widow, because she has no money, that right to redeem was essentially useless. So what Boaz is bringing to the table here is to this other Joe Schmo guy is, hey, by the way, Naomi has redemption rights for this land over here. And you, as the closest kinsman redeemer, you need to redeem this land from her. So then he hears the proposition. Joe Schmo agrees to do it. That's probably what's taking here. But what's interesting about this is, why does Joe Schmo, this nobody, decide now that he's going to redeem the land rights? He knew of Naomi. This is important to the story, I promise you it is. He knew who Naomi was. You remember back in chapter 1 when Naomi and Ruth came back? It said the entire town was abuzz when they came back. Everyone says, is that Naomi? She's the one that left before. How did she get back here? Everybody knew that she came back. In chapter 2, Boaz, when he asked, who's that person over there? The guy who was overseeing the land, his foreman, told him, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law, the Moabite that came back with her. And Boaz immediately knew the story and who that was. So why at this time did this Joe Schmo, the kinsman redeemer, agree to buy the land? Why didn't he do it before? Why didn't he approach Naomi earlier and say, hey, I'm going to redeem this land on your behalf? Believe it or not, the author is setting up a cliffhanger for us right here in this short little verse, because it's starting to reveal the character of this Joe Schmo. So let's keep going in verses 5 through 8, and we'll see exactly why this guy delayed in helping them out. So here we are in verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, the party would take off his sandal and give it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. I've never signed closing docs with the transfer of a sandal. I'm just saying that right off the bat. This is a weird story, right? What is happening here? Again, as I said earlier, this is showing exactly the character of who this guy was, right? So Boaz, he's doing a great thing. He came into this negotiation and he said to this kinsman redeemer in front of all these elders, hey, you know our kinsman redeemer, kinsman Naomi and Elimelech? Yeah, well, she's got usage rights to this land and she wants to give you those usage rights so that you can be her redeemer. Will you take the land? And he says, sure, I'll take the land. So Boaz, being the great negotiator that he is, led with just that part. Then after the kinsman redeemer in front of all those witnesses, the Joe Schmo. After Joe Schmo in front of all of those witnesses agreed, Boaz says, great, now that we've got the first term settled, here's the second term. Second term is you're going to take Ruth the Moabite as your wife. And you're going to take her mother-in-law, the dead man's widow, referring to Elimelech, and you're going to take care of her too throughout her old age. Only on the second term does the guy say, no, I can't do it. Why does he do that? We start to get a picture of what this guy was actually doing and why he never approached Naomi in the first place. See, if he were to step in as the kinsman redeemer a long time ago when Naomi first got there, it would be all of this extra financial expense on his end. He would have had to buy the land back at full value. But as the land progresses through time, its value decreases through time because there's less crops to harvest as the years dwindle. That's how real estate worked at the time. So I think he was waiting so that when he actually had an opportunity to get the land, it would be cheaper. But the other problem is Ruth. Remember, he accepted the deal to the land right now because he got called out in the open. I think he was waiting for all of this to kind of work itself out so he can get it all to himself. But now that Boaz called him out in front of this big council of elders, he had no choice if he wanted to save face. He's going to have to step up and say, okay, I'll take the land and I'll endure this extra cost. But when Boaz introduced Ruth, then he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do this. And the reason is because of how redemption worked. If he were to take Ruth as his wife, then he would have to give Ruth a son. And if he gave Ruth a son, that person would be part of Elimelech's line. So then the land would go to that son, not back to the kinsman redeemer, Joe Schmo. So what are we saying here? We're saying that basically what this guy was doing was waiting. I think he was waiting for Naomi to die. And that when Naomi died, he would get the land to himself. He would still have to buy it, but he'd get all of those rights. He wouldn't have to worry about Ruth, no heir, and he gets to keep the land in his family forever. Now we learn this guy's not a Joe Schmo, he's a schmuck. He's an absolute jerk. But this is what he's doing. And I think this is part of Boaz's shrewdness. I think Boaz knew this in advance. Let's go back to chapter 2 just for a minute. Back in chapter 2 when Ruth coincidentally, went into Boaz's land, he just lavished all kinds of grace and blessing on her, right? Chesed. And he just gave her all kinds of opportunity, gave her the greatest grain, told the guys to throw extra grain on the ground so she can pick up more. Then he gave her an extra 50 pounds worth of grain to take back to Naomi afterwards. He just started pouring out all this kindness. And our question is, when Naomi ended that chapter, he's our kinsman redeemer, why didn't Boaz do that? This answers the question. There was another guy. And Boaz knew if I'm going to do things right, then I'm going to do all the hesed that I possibly can for Ruth, but I'm also going to obey God's law. And if I'm going to obey God's law, that means this guy has the rights first. So I'm going to go to him and make sure that I offer it just that way. But I think Boaz knew this guy was a creep. I think Boaz knew exactly what he was doing, which is why he led with the land first. I think Boaz might have wanted to embarrass this guy. And I think he wanted to embarrass him publicly. That's why he called the 10 elders. That's why he offered the land, and that guy took the bait. And as soon as the schmuck took the bait, Boaz says, great, here's term 2. Now you got to take the ladies also. And he said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Boaz was absolutely masterful in this whole thing. Brilliant guy. So now there's this large crowd. Everybody's watching. Boaz does this brilliant negotiation. And then finally, right, even though we're on this cliffhanger, like, wait a minute, Boaz, what are you doing? What are you doing, Boaz? You said we could tell you wanted the girl. Chapter 3 kind of let us know that. We know you wanted the girl. We know you're going to do things God's way. He just said yes to the land. Now you're offering the girl. What are you doing here? Is he going to get the girl? What's happening? I think this actually gives us a little application lesson here. And it goes to speak to the character of Boaz. As we just painted this picture earlier, Boaz wanted Ruth. I think that's evident from chapter 3. He wanted Ruth. I think he made a plan so that he could go out there, negotiate this so that he could get Ruth. But no matter what, he was going to do it God's way. He was going to put his desire aside and make sure that he pursued everything according to the law that God had given. So what does this mean? It means he had a plan. He was hoping his plan would work, but he risked and sacrificed his own desires for what God's plan would be. He was going to make sure he was going to do things God's way. And I think for you and me here, that's a great question to ask because that is truly faith. How many of us want to sacrifice our desires? How many of us want to sacrifice what we want? How many times when you pray, how about this? How many times when you pray, you kind of pray for God to do things your way instead of not my will, but your will be done? What Boaz is showing us here is what true faith looks like. That if we're going to be a part of God's grand story and God's narrative, that we have to put what we want aside. We have to set our desires down and instead be willing to risk all of those to do things his way, by the book, if you will. And that's what Boaz is doing. And the beauty of this whole story is that when Boaz sacrifices his desires and says, God, I'm going to do it your way, even if it means I don't get what I want, but I'm going to try to make sure it happens the way I want. Boaz is a good negotiator. What happens? He gets the girl anyway. That Joe schmuck decides, I'm not going to take this girl. I'm not going to do that because if I take her, then I have to give her a son. And if I give her a son, then that son's going to get the land, but I want the land for myself, so forget it. I'm not doing it. I'm out. This tells us to the other thing. God honors the faithful. We're going to see here in just a minute exactly what happens to Boaz in the view of the town and, of course, the end of the story. But God honors the faithful, but here's the other thing. He judges the greedy. He judges those that don't give hesed, because that's the difference. Boaz, even though he wanted Ruth, he was going to risk, it was going to cost him financially. He was going to have to pony up all the money to redeem the land. Then he would have to give Ruth a son who would be Obed. But then Obed would take that and it would go back to Elimelech's family and not Boaz's. Boaz knew he was taking all the financial risk on his own, but that other guy wasn't willing to do it. He was greedy. How do we know he was shamed? And how do we know he was publicly humiliated? Let's recap the story. We're at the gate. There's a bunch of elders. They have a legal dispute. Boaz presents him with the legal dispute. The guy refuses to do the thing that he's obligated to do, and so he gives Boaz his sandal. Check out what Deuteronomy 25 says. This is verses 5 through 10. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead. Isn't that what Boaz just said? Carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, actually let's pause there and explain this. So essentially what was happening here is if there was a married couple, right, and that husband died and there were no kids, this widow now needed heirs. And because she needed heirs, it would be the job of the brother to come in, the brother-in-law that is, to come in and provide heirs for her. It's called levirate marriage. That was what the responsibility was. But it wasn't required by the law. And that's what these next verses go into. If somebody didn't want to take care of his brother's name, and that's what this is really about. It's about the brother's name being carried on and not blotted from the earth. If you didn't want to do that duty, there was a way out. And listen to what it says here in verse 7. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, and then spit in his face. That's the public shame and disgrace, right? Space. This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. To us, I know it sounds so funny because we're dealing with super ancient times. I get it. But the whole point is this. For the Israelites, it was a big deal for somebody's name to be blotted out from the earth. That means you incurred some sort of extra judgment from God. It's one thing to die, but it's one thing for your name to be gone from history. And so because of that, because this was seen as extra judgment, extra shame, it was the job of the brother-in-law to come in to ensure that his brother's name would be protected and that it would go on. And if this guy wasn't willing to do that duty, then there was a way out. And that way out was to go before the elders, to hash it out. And if he refused, he'd have to give him the sandal, and then he'd get his face spit in. And then his family would from now on be known as the family of the unsandaled, because now the pejorative goes the other way. Sure, your brother might not have a line to speak of moving forward, but you had no love for your brother, and you were willing to let his family line be blotted out, so now your family will carry that shame for the rest of your life. That's what this was about. And so when we get back to the story here with Boaz and Ruth, the guy, the schmuck, was not required to do this. But if he chose not to, then he would have to walk away in shame. And that's exactly what happens in this story. We continue, right? If we think about everything that just happened, it's a beautiful story, right? Because Boaz's character is right there. But this guy, when he hands the sandal off, what happens? He walks away from the story and he's gone. So many times throughout this, it's all about names, not letting Elimelech's name go out. And here we have the schmuck that was trying to take advantage of Naomi walk away anonymous. That's a sign of judgment. So what about the honor? Well, let's listen to how the people honor Boaz. This is in verse 9. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon." Notice that contrast, right? The anonymous schmuck walked away, and now the dead get their names brought back into the story. "I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with this property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." And so we can tell by Boaz's oath and everything that he said, the author clearly had Deuteronomy 25 in mind. We see the recapitulated theme of the names of the dead coming back and not being blotted out, that they're going to stay around now forever because these guys are going to be honored through what Boaz just did. You can hear Boaz celebrating, right? Like, that was a close one. I almost lost the girl, but I got the girl, and now I'm going to celebrate, and that's exactly what he does. And God does it. He honors Boaz's hesed. He honors all of the generosity that Boaz poured out on Ruth and Naomi and gave Boaz his actual desires. And it continues through verse 11 and 12. Let's keep reading. Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore before Judah." And I want to say this again. Notice what's happening, right? This is at the gate. The elders were the one that were supposed to agree on all this. But there's a crowd. There's a crowd that's watched this entire thing. And as the anonymous guy walks away in shame, the crowd themselves praise and honor Boaz. They're blessing Ruth. They're blessing Boaz because of all of this stuff that's happened. But notice, he starts naming off all of these names. Rachel, Leah, Judah, Perez. You're going to be famous in Bethlehem and all these things. And when we hear of Bethlehem, we obviously think of Jesus, right? "Oh, little town of Bethlehem." I think there was a king from Bethlehem too. Wasn't it King David? Spoiler alert, that's coming in a couple verses. But there is a crowd, not just the elders. And as they start proclaiming all these things, I think the narrator is switching their tone to be more prophetic than it is declarative. Because while they're going back to Rachel and Leah, those were the sons of Jacob. And those were the mothers of the 12 brothers that would be the 12 tribes of Egypt. Egypt? It's like borderline heresy. Let's try this again, Randy. Israel. They would be the 12 sons of Israel. The 12 tribes would come from them. So they're going back to Rachel and Leah. They then go back to this guy Perez, who was the son of Judah, which is the tribe that they're from. So why would they talk about these two in that way? They're pronouncing this huge blessing on them, but also switching to prophetic. This couple has something more to offer Israel than anybody could possibly imagine. What is that thing that they have to offer? We're going to find out right now here at the end of our story. Here we are in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. We're going to stop there because I can't give away the cliffhanger. I can't give it away at the end, right? So we're going to stop right there. This section confirms exactly what we've known the entire time through the book of Ruth. Yeah, these people at the end are prophesying that this couple has something big to offer, but we've kind of known that for quite some time. But what they communicate and what we see here happen to Naomi is that this was always God's plan to begin with. Just as he guided Jacob, just as he brought the 12 sons through Rachel and Leah, he has been writing a story, and this was God's plan. Remember, in the book of Ruth, there's only 2 times that God gets credit for doing something directly. This is one of them, causing Ruth's conception. That's the narrator's way of saying all that stuff that happened, all that tragedy, back from chapter 1, I was working to redeem that. That means all of the coincidence that God lined up, it's because he's making his story happen. Then in chapter 3, we see exactly how the people were willing to play a part in God's plan and his story. And then finally in chapter 4, we see God's story is written and it's done. He made it happen. He caused Naomi to have a son again. And so the women acknowledge that this is what God has provided. This was the thing. This was the redemption. They even call the son the guardian redeemer. Why? Because as Obed would grow up, he would then look after his grandma. He would look after his mother as well. They know this because of the character of Ruth. I think this is the beautiful part of this whole story. They say that they know that Obed is going to do all of these things because of Ruth. Because Ruth showed love to Naomi that was better than 7 sons. In other words, no matter how many sons Naomi was able to have, their love would never be able to match the amount of love that Ruth had shown her. And so maybe, I'm just going to throw this out there, maybe, just maybe, there's something to that. That the character of parents, the way that we raise our kids, has an effect on the way they act, and it might have something to impact their character and generations to come. Maybe God's hinting at something like that. And so this famous family, right, these two are now going to be building something in Israel. And what exactly are they going to be building? Let's look in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. That's it. That's the end of our story. Sure, he's got a genealogy, and we can read genealogies, and we all love genealogies, right? Bunch of names we never heard of that we can't even pronounce. But this is the end of the story. Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. You have to picture the image of somebody who's lost so much, who went from being angry and bitter at God to being hopeful because she saw him start to work, to then having confidence that a plan is now going to happen. And now this grandmother is holding her new grandson, looking straight into his face, beaming with a smile as that baby is probably screaming at him because that's what babies do, right? But nonetheless, this is the image of a grandmother joyfully cradling her new grandson. And when they say this line, Naomi has a son, that's the way of the story finally coming to an end. Naomi went from angry to hopeful to confident to completely restored by the work of God. The widow who returned to Bethlehem empty is now full. And now sitting in fullness, her life has been filled and restored by that joy. Staring into this wonderful gift, the Hesed of God, her new grandson, Obed. What a beautiful story. A beautiful story that helps us understand how we can be a part of God's story, because things happen that just don't make sense. But we see from Naomi that a faithful life can move from bitter and angry to hopeful to praising, from patient to confident, and then finally restored by God. So what's the lesson? What is the lesson of this story? We get it in 17b. I love this part because the author throws this out there just really quickly, and it's kind of like meant to hang there. We can lose the line, but the line is so important. Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What an incredible line. I know it's so small, but it really is. Remember this book, it's in the time of the Judges. This is the most chaotic, murderous, a horrible time in Israel's history. And in fact, the book of Judges ends with people saying, like basically ready to genocide one of the tribes. And the author comments at the end of Judges, it was this bad because Israel had no king. And so during the time of the Judges, this story takes place. We see the redemptive God, the hand of God working to redeem even in the most chaotic of situations to bring about this son who would then bring about the greatest king in Israel's history. God was at work. God was always writing his story. And that's exactly it. David was the greatest king. He united all of these 10 tribes. He had the capital back in Judah. He remained faithful to the covenant. And in the genealogy that follows, we see even more. So yeah, for the Jews, they're looking at this going, awesome, King David. But as Christians, we're looking at this and going, what? Oh, awesome, Jesus. And that's absolutely true. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, when he lists his genealogies, it is a carbon copy of what the author of Ruth gives us right here. Name for name. Because Matthew wants us to know that this story back here of Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, gave us the great, I think it was 29 greats that should go in front of that before we get to Jesus. So for us as Christians, this isn't just a story about the King of Israel. It's a story about the King of Kings. And when we're looking at this narrative of the King of Kings coming about way back here in ancient history, it tells us something about how we play a role in God's story. Now listen, this is not going to be fluffy. It's not going to be one of those inspirational things where you're going to walk out of here feeling good. People have accused me of not being a preacher that fluffs your pillow. That's actually true. That's a direct quote. But when we think about how grand this story was, it lets us know God's story, it's bigger than you. It's not very comforting, is it? See, our culture right now wants to make all of these things about us as much as we possibly can. And while we play a role in God's story, we certainly do. God's story is way bigger than us. Way bigger than we can possibly imagine. See, the author of Ruth, he took a telescope and just zoomed in on this one little portion of history. And yes, these two random, insignificant widows were shown the tender love and care, the chesed of God himself. And while we're looking at their lives through this telescope zoomed in, at the end, he zooms out to give us a picture of David. And then when we get to the Gospels, we zoom out even more to get a picture of the Messiah. And if we take the ministry of Jesus even more, we get the big view of eternity. God's story is bigger than you. You have a role to play, but if his story is bigger than you, you don't know what's next. It's bigger than our lives. It's bigger than this brief moment of time. And even though these people were still insignificant, they all played a role in God's salvation story. Why? God honored them. They played a role in God's story, and God used every one of them, particularly Ruth and Boaz, because what they did was showed unremarkable love, unremarkable chesed for everybody that they encountered. And this is the lesson. God honors his people when they give his chesed to others. So as we conclude this wonderful story of Ruth, we are left with this one question. What role are you going to play in God's story? You're a part of it. You're a part of God's story. It's bigger than you. That's true. And if you're going to play in a role in God's story, you got to let your desires go. But that's kind of what the author is telling us. He's showing us how we get to play a role in God's story. So this is going to be super practical. You guys ready for this? How many of you are note takers? You have to raise your hands because they're writing. Don't do that. This part's going to be super practical. So think about Ruth and where we've come from through the entire story. How do we actually participate in God's big divine plan? Look at how God has shown you chesed and give that chesed back. Remember chesed, it means showing love, kindness, compassion, generosity, way above and beyond what the minimum requirement is, and often at great cost to yourself and when the other person could not pay you back. So look at what God has done in your life. Because that's one of the themes of Ruth, is God pouring out chesed onto these people, and then our two characters, Ruth and Boaz, then giving chesed to everybody else. If we start from that place, then these next ones are going to make much more sense. See tragedy and crisis as part of the story. None of us want to go through tragedy. None of us want to go through loss. None of us want to see loved ones die. We don't want to see any of that stuff happen. We never want to experience it. But as we saw from Naomi back in chapter 1, through that tragedy, God was working a plan of redemption. So see tragedy and crisis as part of the story. When it happens, ask yourself, okay, God, what are you going to do? How are you going to redeem this? How are you going to make this part of your story? And so when that happens, don't become bitter. Don't become angry at God. Instead, become expectant for what he's going to do. The third thing, always watch for what God is up to. This is the chapter on coincidence, right? It just so happened. Ruth just happened to walk into Boaz's field. All of these things that start to add up that look like coincidence from human perspective, ask yourself instead, God, what are you up to? You see how the questions progress? It goes from, okay, God, what are you going to do? To starting to see God's hand move, and then start to say to yourself, okay, God, what are you up to? You're starting to see him work. So don't dismiss coincidence as simply coincidence. Always watch for what God is doing and assume that he's working. And when God is working, work with him. We're not intended to just sit idly by, passively waiting for God to do everything for us. Boaz and Naomi got to work. When they saw God working, they did it. They started to work with him. Put your desires and your outcomes aside and surrender to doing things his way. One of the most important things for us to remember when it comes to this grand story that God is writing, it's not my story, it's his story. I'm in it, but it's his story, not mine. And if it's his story, then that means I got to put down how I want the story to go and surrender to his will and what he's going to do instead. Then, finally, what Naomi said to Ruth, sit tight, be patient, be confident. God is going to work it out. God does have a plan of redemption. And as we saw through the story, he honors his faithful people. So, let me close with this one last thought. Because we got to summarize the story, right? Tragedy happens. When tragedy happens, we have a choice to get bitter or angry with God. Or we can ask him, what are you going to do? How are you going to redeem this? When we do that, we accept and we start to watch how he's going to work. And when we start to see how he works, we get hopeful. Okay, God, what are you up to? And then finally, we get to a place where we're ready to work with God and follow him through that whole thing and eagerly wait the redemption plan that follows. Remember, God is writing a big story. We are a part of that story, but it's his story and it's not ours. Let's stand. This is your first time to the Vineyard. One of the things that we believe is that the Holy Spirit still works, that he wants to heal people, he wants to deliver people, he wants to speak to us, he wants to minister to us. And so we always leave space for him to do that. We don't try to make anything happen, we don't try to force it, we just make ourselves available to whatever he wants to do. And so we hold out our hands in this posture like we're ready to receive a gift. And it's not manipulation at all. It's just us saying, God, I'm ready to receive from you this morning, whatever you have for me. And we pray this simple prayer, come Holy Spirit. So come Holy Spirit. We ask that you have your way in this moment. Give us words, speak to us, and encourage us. The prayer team come up over here to the right-hand side and to the left-hand side. We're going to call out just a couple of words for healing and for ministry time. And if any of these words are for you, I'd encourage you to come forward and receive prayer from one of the prayer team members. Because when one of these words are spoken and you know it's from you, it's God trying to get your attention, letting you know that he wants to do something this morning for you and with you. So here's the words. One of them was very simple. It's a fear of flying. We had another one for blood pressure problems and also a ringing in the ear. Someone with a sprained wrist. A couple of others. Someone you were told and it impacted you really hard that you're a coward, and that's been sticking to you and you can't let that go. Another person that's having difficulty going through the grieving process. Another word for some degeneration thing that's happening in the eyes. And then someone who's struggling with addiction, particularly to sleep medications. So what we're going to do is move into a time where we sing this next chorus. We're just going to worship God. And as we worship God, if any of those words were for you, again, come forward, receive prayer. I'll be up here right in the front, and our prayer team is off here to the side.
There is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Hold me, there is no one beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around. And I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation, and I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation, and I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Told me there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around
So, Father, we thank you that you have never stop showing your kindness, your love, your hesed for us. And for those of us that are walking through tragedy and crisis right now, help us to see that. To see that you've never stopped, and even in the midst of all this, you're still showing love and you're still showing kindness. Help us to see the ways that you're working your story, that you're working your plan of redemption, not just for our lives, but the grand plan that you have written. Give us the courage, give us the wisdom and the discernment to walk and partner with you in this grand story, eagerly but patiently, waiting for that moment of redemption. We yield our desires to your authorship. We yield the way we want things to go to your sovereignty. We recognize this morning that it's your story and not ours, but we're thankful that we get to play a part in it. So Holy Spirit, have your way in our lives. Let us show the same love that you've given to us, to everybody else that we encounter. And Jesus, we say these things in your name. Amen. If you need prayer for anything at all, please come forward. We would love the opportunity to pray. For everybody else, remember we have our reception for Megan and Dallas. Please stick around. Let them know how much you love them, how much they'll be missed, and have a blessed week.